Dear President, dear friends, let me echo State Minister Michael Roth in expressing my great pleasure to be with you today to think together as citizens and politicians, as social scientists, as well as real scientists, Professor Grass, and as scholars across borders. And it is a special pleasure for me to speak in the Mecca of quantum mechanics, a domain I have been immersed in vicariously for the last 3 decades, thanks to a husband, Professor of Philosophy of Physics, who literally lives in parallel universes. So, in the spirit of Heisenberg and Max Born, if we are indeed hovering between disintegration of Europe and redemption of Europe, each side and the infinite variance in between unfolds in different universes. So perhaps it doesn't matter in the end. Perhaps. Still, what we are asking together here in the beautiful University of Göttingen is, where is the arc of our universe? We do care. Where is it taking us? Towards societal Big Bang, the revolt of the left behinds, the rise of the authoritarian international, Putin, Orban, Erdogan, Kaczynski, Le Pen, Petri, and perhaps most importantly, the prospect that resentment and anger at home, we heard a lot about this from our previous speakers, might lead to dislocation abroad, a link, home and abroad, incarnated today in Washington by a narcissistic leader who seems to cement for us the return of history. Or should we look to Hegel too on the other side, and the cunning of reason, which can appeal to people's basic yearning for freedom everywhere, as Obama brilliantly reminded us in Athens on Wednesday, in trying to also reassure us about our plight with the next president coming, and before more safely endorsing your chancellor for fourth term yesterday. Democracy may be hard to love, was Obama telling us, but it is harder still to hate. Now, in a characteristically brilliant interview published in English yesterday, Habermas analyzes the many failures of capitalist democracy. But he then calls, in answer to these challenges, for what he calls renewed political polarization, for progressives to disentangle themselves from neoliberals. While he might be right in some ways, for my part, I would like to suggest to you tonight a different take away from what I often call the tyranny of dichotomies. Us, them, those we like, those we don't like, those we fight, those who are with us or against us. Without entering a semantic debate around good and bad populism, we've talked about populism tonight, I suggest that we must start from noting that because authoritarian populists do not have the answers for improving prosperity and security for all, they therefore have to resort to nationalist glorification. They do that not only by conceptualizing a people as homogeneous, usually about half of a population, and constructing fear of internal and external enemies, but they also do something more subtle. They claim exclusive ownership of a certain national timeline, a mythical one as that. And so I would suggest to you that our relationship to time is that what we must reclaim from populism. remembering that Brexit and Trumpism would never have happened if our students' generation had been in charge and the main voters. And suggesting, therefore, that what we really need in Europe today is an intergenerational coalition whose banner is, "It is urgent to act long-term." And the EU has a very special role to play in that banner as the guardian of the long term, which is why for a long time I have spoken of the need for a very simple idea, sustainable integration. And therefore, and in this spirit, I feel that it is especially appropriate for me to discuss this with you today in Göttingen under the banner of this conference, Science for Peace and Sustainability. And speaking of Göttingen, Lord Mayor Kohler, let me say something more personal as a prelude. As we said in the 60s, the personal is the political, right? So I'm here today with my daughter and my mother for a 3-generation pilgrimage, I confess to you. My mother, José Reinhardt, is the daughter of a man who was an anti-Nazi resistant and a French mother. He was from Erfurt. And this is also why, as Professor Bush knows very well, I am especially close, and very close to my heart, the Oxford-Göttingen collaboration around the memory of Adam von Trott. And I very much know and hope that this collaboration will go on for as long as we are here. Now, my mother was here in Göttingen for a year 60 years ago at the Nansen House, which maybe many of you might remember was created by a Swedish enlightened man to bring together young Germans and French in this city. And her idea of what it meant to be European was, well, I'm neither German nor French. I am a European. I will not sing the national hymns. Now, much time has passed, and peace in Europe has indeed first been embodied and embedded by the yearning for this kind of reconciliation, the European dream that enemies can become neighbors and neighbors can become friends. And this was the Nansen House. But of course, what we scholars of European integration study and have for decades is the story of an EU's creation, which takes us from that reconciliation to institutions. Institutions as the admission that the dream cannot do all the work itself, all by itself. And that these institutions, of course, were institutions that were supposed to reflect the fact that Europe was an anti-hegemonic project, not an anti-national project, there to protect small states and vulnerable people, and that it was founded on an ideal, which I exemplify with this image here, of mutual recognition between the peoples of Europe and their differences in all sorts of realms, from the politics to the economics to the cultural. Now, I leave to my daughter to define her Europe for herself and her generation. But in saying so, I feel terribly guilty, like many, many parents in Britain today, that we may have robbed her and all her friends of something very precious, what links her to her roots on the continent as a rooted European cosmopolitan. So we have a lot to answer for with Brexit. And so let us pause a moment to think about Brexit. And all of our preceding speakers seem to have mourned Brexit on this stage. Tell me, what does it say about the prospect of Brexit that the word itself is today the preferred contender for its elucidation? Brexit means Brexit. We each have our own way of dealing with the ubiquitous tautology of Brexit means Brexit. Those on the UK departing ship might do it with glee or despair or remorse. Those on the abandoned shores of the continent with hurt, spite, or sadness. But then, well, especially us in this room, we rationalize. That's what we do. We give reason a go with what has happened. We ask the why question, and many in this room do this brilliantly. Why did this happen? Or we ask, what will or should happen next? But let me say, before explanation and implications, I believe that we need to discuss the what. The meaning of meaning in Brexit means Brexit. Meaning. For which narrative will dominate the next 2 years will determine not only the nature of this Brexit, but also the nature of the EU itself. Now, I would like to propose to that one way to think about all this is the special power of archetypal myths or narrative. Perhaps because through myths, we can reinvent way of conducting our democratic conversation across borders and within our countries by connecting political imaginaries that may be very different and connecting them with democratic practice, appealing to our shared, somehow fundamental intuitions, countering or perhaps just supplementing the Habermasian idea of democracy as deliberative rationality, not because people cannot be rational, but because to be so together, to be rational together, they need common languages in every sense of the term languages. Myth also, however, paradoxically, because thinking through their prism may help recover the recul of modernity by supporting a critical distance, a kind of collective self-reflectiveness. Since, you know, every myth always stays unresolved. So, I would like to suggest to you, I see 3 stories about Brexit and its meaning for Europe woven together. They're not internally coherent, but they compete in our imagination to make sense of it all. Now, the first and most straightforward and perhaps most widely shared meaning of Brexit in Britain and on the continent is simply that it's a very British thing indeed, and therefore, well, a British problem. It's the British exodus. Feeling enslaved by the shackles of Brussels and threatened by the hostile environment that we exhibit on the European continent, these Brits have taken a journey of escape from their shores to the promised land. And they might spend 40 years in the wilderness, but it's worth it, they think. This is, you know, the story of British exceptionalism, which everyone, historians, sociologists, political scientists, seem to tell us is overdetermined. Overdetermined by geography, the island thing, by history, never invaded, as opposed to the rest of us on the continent, by political culture, Westminster supreme, our habeas corpus, or class culture. Because in Britain, you keep your working class Euroscepticism even when graduating to the middle class. So as a result, all sorts of contrasts happened. And when European people on the continent are afraid, say, of refugees, well, the UK are afraid of Europeans. And many who voted for Brexit, you know, we think, well, usually people vote for the status quo. That's something we know as social scientists. Well, but then many people, so why did they vote against it? But in fact, sometimes if you scratch the surface, you will see that many in Britain think they're actually not really in the EU, which after all is the euro. So leaving is actually the status quo in a funny way. In any case, this is British exceptionalism. Complicated story, trust me, I live there. And maybe with my French hat, I would say de Gaulle was prescient. The Brits are simply not European enough to remain part of this EU. But as with all myth, of course, the story is much more complicated. As Michael Roth just stressed a moment ago, there are many tribes in this exodus too, many tribes. It's about to take place with, and it's about to take with it, this exodus, 16 million Brits and almost 3 million EU citizens in Britain who do not believe in any promised land out there, who do not relish 40 years in the wilderness and will not be taken except screaming and kicking. So how do we make sense of the very real possibility that the vote could have gone the other way, if only? You know, is this an act of collective domination in Britain? No one would be talking about British exceptionalism if all but 2% of the vote had gone the other way. Many tribes, even among the leavers, where the story is not that straightforward either, because the Brits who feel they want to leave seem to have two radically different ways of not being European enough, as de Gaulle would say. One is that they find Europe too big for them, the little Englander, and the other is that they find it too small, the parochials and the globalists, very different tribes. Unfortunately for the globalist tribe, most of the rest of the world, and I've been to many countries outside the EU since Brexit, or spoken to many people, they seem to buy the first variant of British exceptionalism. Ha ha ha, you are a very small island after all, even if you conquered us last century. Now, as for Europeans on the continent, it's not really clear which of these two versions, too small, too big, they dislike the most, since they each make them feel irrelevant, but in a different way. If the Brits have left us, the continentals, because they find Europe too big, we can confine the meaning of Brexit to all that is pathetic about British exceptionalism. But if they've left because they find Europe too small, they may be delusional, but it has some panache. And there's a bit of a fear, just a bit, there too on the continent. What if Britain did manage to turn Brexit into a successful experiment, a new version of cool Britannia powerhood in the world? Oops. And we must ask, why has British exceptionalism in whatever variant become such an existential problem that they had to part the sea? Does this mean you cannot be yourself in the EU, however different? When European leaders exclaim too on their end, Brexit is Brexit, aren't they trying to enact a more self-aggrandizing version of Exodus? Turn Exodus into a kind of banishment story, where it is they, the Europeans, the continentals, and they alone who stand at the gate. This is why I put a photo of Eve, a painting of Eve right there, the first banished person in our universe. Yet we know, of course, that Exodus hurts the banisher more than the banished, that Britain, or at least as much, that Britain has been, come on, the great balancer of the French on behalf of the German on the behalf of the French, and of both on behalf of the periphery, the smaller states. So in the end, if you are in this room a hard-headed Euro-federalist, this exodus might be an old dream come true, especially if you can throw out the rest of the peripheral family, Poles, Greeks, Romanian, who should never have gotten in the first place. And I must say, I have heard this no secret sing-song for many, many years in Brussels, in Paris, and even Berlin. But what if Brexit means that exceptionalism in Europe is no exception? Which brings me this question to a second archetypal myth. This is all the stories of reckoning, of last judgment, that haunt our collective imagination. You see a picture there of Oedipus. This is when he blinded himself after learning that he'd killed his dad and married his mom. Well, in this story of reckoning, Europeans need to read Brexit as a revealer of rather terribly uncomfortable truth. And denial is the only reason Europeans hang on to the exceptionalism story that we just told. In fact, Brexit, proclaim Eurosceptics of all shades, is about the fate that is awaiting the EU. It's no longer about Britain, but about the EU itself. Brexit is not about Britain will leave or should leave, but it means everyone should leave. The Brits have only served to make this visible. And of course, the story of reckoning tells us that this tsunami of crisis, which we discuss and live through endlessly, this tsunami is not coming from nowhere, but one of our own making, a great punishment for past deeds. It tells us that the EU is being punished less for what it has done great things, than for what it has failed to do, to deal with globalization and unfair competition, refugees and uncontrolled migration, the suffering of the poor and the free riding of the rich, what it has failed to do. With Brexit, the specter of disintegration has become real and institutionalized in procedures, numbers of articles, summit agendas. Euroscepticism is now not only in power in some of the European capital, but able to command the very boundaries of Europe, a core marker of our collective identity, if there is such a thing. And it has transformed every one of our domestic theaters. But of course, this archetype of the reckoning and last judgment is no more straightforward than Exodus. For one, the truth that must be faced, what is it? It's a very elusive affair. Oedipus maybe was always going to kill his dad and marry his mom, but for what reason? Who had failed to read the prophecy? And secondly, of course, reckonings do come in different shapes and form. Some believe in indiscriminate reckoning. Everyone will be heard. And others, that the last judgment is all about sorting the worthy from the sinner. EU reform is possible. Skepticism is not destruction. Some believe we have agency in the story. The faster EU leaders let go of the exceptionalist story, the more likely they are to caution the reckoning. And some believe that the last judgment will never happen, that Brexit means that the EU now lives in a state of permanent ontological insecurity, in the shadow of the last judgment, forever postponed, forever possible. And of course, we face a different idea of reckoning depending on whose voice prevails, between two sides who voted Brexit and all of those on the continent who echoed their feelings. Those who voted against Brussels, but for London/Westminster, and those who voted against London through Brussels, against their capital. Indeed, take back control is a slogan that hits home all around Europe. We know this. And we need to know that people will use a vote against Brussels also to vote against their own political elites, because they understand that the EU has been, in their view, an enabler of elite collusion for the political class across Europe to escape domestic political constraint, hiding behind EU decisions. And this anti-elite backlash may be worldwide, we've said this, but European elites somehow, at least to those citizens, seem top of the class. Somehow they've managed to build the infamous Weberian iron cage of bureaucracy, but out of the reach of the electoral cycles, an iron cage in a bubble, the Brussels bubble. Now, in my view, without assuming that skepticism has captured the public imagination throughout, across member states, the Eurosphere will ignore the prophecy of it at its own peril until unraveling makes it blindingly obvious. We need to acknowledge the difference between, on one hand, existential skepticism, kill the EU, and transformative skepticism. In other words, skepticism about the raison d'être of the EU versus skepticism about its way of being. And we need to fend off the former, obviously, but to take the later very seriously. Which brings me to my third archetypal myth. Whatever the important truth of the tension I just stated, this third myth about the meaning of Brexit attaches itself to the essence of the EU, but in the longue durée. It's Brexit as sacrifice. This is a painting, of course, of Iphigenia, sacrificed by her father so that, as most of you know, the troops could go to conquer Troy with the winds rising again. So in this third myth, the myth of sacrifice, Brexit is not a flare for something that will happen to Europe, reckoning, but rather an event that in itself changes the nature of that world, of European world, and at least the perception of it, and therefore the perception of what it could be. Very simply, Britain leaving means that you can leave the EU. And this tells us something about the EU as a pluralist project, irrespective of who leaves or the circumstances of this leaving. Somehow, the way you leave it defines the essence of Europe. And I remember, as a member of the convention in 2002, writing a constitution for Europe, when we discussed the creation of Article 50, how hardcore federalists thought this was a sovereignist ploy. Hey, good old nations do not have prenups. They do not talk about how we're going to divorce. But for people like me and friends, as Euro idealists, we felt this was a great formalization of an important truth. The idea that Europe and the EU is a union of peoples who govern together but not as one and remain together by choice. I call that democracy. Now, obviously, what I supported there in theory, I didn't have to support in practice, and I, believe me, was very active on the Remain side in the referendum. In fact, I never dreamt that my country of adoption, Britain, would sacrifice so much for the sake of proving a theoretical point. So, under the idea of sacrifice, however, we do have, again, variants. Again, it's more complicated than that. You know, one variant is very dominant on the continent. Yes, Brexit means you can leave Europe, and so you should. Somehow, this Brexit thing, wow, it's a good thing. They've sacrificed themselves to free us from their veto and construct a truly federal Europe at last in the core. In short, Iphigenia did not burn at the stake in vain. You know, the Greeks did reach Troy. And after all, do people say more or less tongue-in-cheek, the Brits have a historical habit to come to the rescue of the divided European tribes, you know, Napoleon and the Reich. They do the deeds, but then sacrifice and leave us among ourselves. In fact, Boris Johnson says this all the time. Brexit, you're Europeans. It will be good for you now that you can integrate in peace without us. But this version seems to forget that in most stories of sacrifice, the sacrificial victim is not generally the bad guy. Nor is it clear that an unworthy sacrifice will be carried through. You know, in the story of Iphigenia, you see it in the painting. She was actually at the very last minute and secretly replaced by a goat. So for me, to the heroic story of sacrifice, I prefer a notion of ironic sacrifice. And here the real meaning of Brexit should be to demonstrate that you can leave, yes, this union, this pluralist union, and that therefore it is this very freedom to leave that ought to entice you to stay. You can leave and therefore you shouldn't. A kind of positive deterrence theory. Now, the irony of this story of sacrifice for the sake of a more pluralist EU is that it requires the sacrifice of perhaps the most pluralist country in Europe, and that a true pluralist Europe would be fit for purpose of accommodating this British variety. And of course, few have noted the contradiction in the intense Brexiter discourse on the European Leviathan. How could it be a Leviathan that clips your wings if you can leave so easily? But let me tell you a story that is unlikely to happen in our universe, but is for sure happening in one of the infinite number of universes out there. Now, you know, in a few days, there will be an Article 50 ruling by the British Supreme Court, and it's possible that it will explain that actually Brexit is reversible. And it's possible that you might have a general election or a second referendum, and that the Brits will kind of think again. But this will depend, I contend, on what happens here on the continent, on what the EU will look like and will start changing in the next few years. This new ambition for Europe, which I alluded to before, and which I call a Europe of sustainable integration. You know, our leaders met in September in Bratislava to explain everything they would do to respond to the Brexit challenge, from external borders to security. But their main message was protective Europe. And fair enough, maybe it's okay, but it somehow implies perhaps that an overwhelming focus on protection again might ring the bell of overreach, because historically, we all know that state machineries have been set up and allowed to grow precisely in order to protect populations from internal and external dangers. And I'm not sure this should be Europe's destiny. In my view, if we're going to embrace such a motive, we have to guard Europe against its own propensity for centralization drift. Or as Chancellor Merkel likes to say, we don't need more Europe, but a better Europe. But still, maybe this does still not convey a concrete and positive vision for what we want Europe to be after the shock of Brexit. And so in my alternative universe, I ask, can we reshape a Europe that a majority of its citizens in every EU state, including Britain, would want to be part of? And this Europe, this vision I label sustainable integration, as a practice and as a state of mind. Something which is about changing the way we change in Europe. An avowed commitment to sustainability as a goal, not only for our global environment, but also for our cities, our security, our welfare state. And in European parlance, these development goals that are sustainable and now applicable for Europe. But it also turns this generic commitment that we feel is so important into a broader philosophy of transnational governance. It's about political idea which starts with the recognition that precisely because the EU is a sum of governments which cannot be collectively impeached, we call this democratic deficit, don't we? Well, if that's the case, if we really do have this problem, then Europe should be about a different kind of democracy, a democracy with foresight, perhaps partially shielded from the short-term ups and downs of electoral politics, yet attuned to the overwhelming desire of the public to preserve our world for our children and grandchildren. This is a Europe atoning for its collective lack of accountability, which becomes accountable to the long term, a guardian of the long term. It's a Europe that emphasizes the kind of thing we know in the virtual world: resilience, robustness, distributed intelligence, adaptive learning. And Mr. Wenzel, a Europe which has an agenda politically desirable because it needs to be applied through empowerment rather than centralization, the channeling of local democratic energy in the spirit of groundswell bottom-up climate action, which is what happened in the Paris COP21. The biggest commitments were from the locals, the cities and the regions. So we need to reassert in this sustainable Europe, of course, the force of empathy, and here I contrast two pictures, the second being taken on a beach and on a Greek island with refugees coming and not seen. Because I think here again, Michael Roth spoke of the plight of the refugees. Here again, sustainable integration of Europe, but also in Europe, is a bottom-up story. Governments reflect and echoes the impulses of their population. And of course, I would say sustainable integration must evolve to make exit less palatable ex ante rather than punishing it ex post. Call it exit interruptus. This means refining the various proxies for exits, which we call differentiated integration, short of dreaming of a core and a periphery. What the British saga has taught us is that the EU as a whole does not take sufficiently into account the unequal impact of its principles and laws, including when pushing the principle of free movement of people. It needs to offer differentiated and flexible approaches if the governments and the citizens will not take this differentiated integration in their own hand and exit altogether. Of course, there are other versions of a pluralist Europe. In Oxford, we talk about chaotic pluralism, the kind of pluralism we're seeing emerge on the web, and I like these ideas above all because in the process, the EU could become more radically open to new generations, their mode of open political activism, perhaps without the echo chamber problem. You know, when the new generation is involved into liking and sharing and tweeting and retweeting and following and uploading and downloading, they have new opportunities to exert continuous pressure on states, much broader and differentiated than envisaged by early pluralists. And of course, we would need to talk about the pitfalls of this too. And last but not least, Obama was in Athens just before Berlin, not just to talk about 2,000 years of the story of democracy, but to send a message that concerns the Greco-German saga and therefore the euro at large. That yes, it might be right to insist, like the German government does, that risk sharing must go hand in hand with risk reduction in the Eurozone. That you must get other countries to behave if you're going to mutualize the consequences of their behavior. But as you do so, you need to do it embedded in the long term. You need to make the game, the relationship sustainable, whether we're talking about debts or macroeconomic imbalances, or indeed the way in which we see each other and engage into each other, the way in which we go beyond prejudices and try to reinvent the spirit of mutual recognition in Europe. So to conclude, let me come back to my three Brexit narratives of exceptionalism, skepticism, pluralism, or exodus, reckoning, and sacrifice. Make no mistake, we have entered in Europe a war of narratives whose protagonists will spare no crude shortcuts or Manichaean reasoning. If we're not careful, the collateral damage could be those values that we hold dear and in whose name the battle is fought in the first place: honesty, friendship, freedom. So, if I was to put my cards on the table, let me say this. For my children's sake, and against all odds, I do hope with half of the British voters and 2/3 of voters under 24, that the Brits might come to their senses and call off their exodus with a little help from their friends, starting above all with Germany. A Germany who, of course, may be a reluctant leader, even a reluctant hegemon, but can only be a leader if it finds the words and the action to have followers around Europe. You can't be a leader without followers. Now, if we stay in this universe, and if Brexit was to happen, short of the miracle that I'm hoping for, I hope that the bright side of British exceptionalism, including irony, will continue to enliven our European debate, and that the right kind of Euroscepticism, after all, as intellectuals, we are all skeptics, as Socrates would say, that the right kind will prevail in the EU, and that our elites, all of us, will realize that conspiring with one another will only make us even more deaf to the voices of change. And I hope that Europeans will follow Michelle Obama's injunction to take the high ground and collectively address our predicament with intelligence, but also humility, which is no less what the world expects of us. And if this happens in the next 10 years, yes, the UK sacrifice would not have been in vain. Not because, as they say in France, plus de veto, but because, like Iphigenia, she will have allowed a new odyssey for Europe to unfold. And if we do so, the rest of the world is more likely to receive that British sacrifice, not as a sign of weakness and decline, but as a sign of Europe's continued relevance as a fascinating, if flawed, experiment in pluralist transnational governance, a theme which I'm absolutely excited that we will explore in the next day in the University of Göttingen, and much, much looking forward to. Thank you very much.